Thank you for that introduction. I came here today to talk to you about two different lines of evidence that I think will not only be of interest to researchers, but also the architects in the room. And broadly speaking, I hope that these will give both groups something to think about in the future in terms of how we navigate spaces, and not only that, but how we navigate unfamiliar spaces. At the heart of my talk, I'm going to focus on the topic of space syntax, which is a method used in architecture, at least some architectural practice. And since I don't expect everyone in the room to be an expert at that technique, I'm going to start by giving you a crash course in what space syntax roughly looks at. The broad question, at the broadest level, what space syntax and what I'm interested in looking at and explaining is how we navigate unfamiliar spaces. At the heart of it, this should be something that should be extremely difficult for us to do. When we go to a new city, and here we have a picture of New York and a picture of London, that the first time we're there, we don't know the important landmarks necessarily, we don't know what roads to use, and yet somehow we manage to find our way. And also, I'd like to add that not only that, but the structure of the environment itself is also very important. And I think intuitively, most of us would agree that New York is probably a lot more easy to navigate than London. And architecture gives us some insights into why this is the case, especially the work of space syntax. Space syntax broadly consists of the ideas of looking at how the entire structure of environment as a spatial system can be used to predict human behavior. And it was introduced by Bill Hillier at UCL. And broadly speaking, what it involves is collapsing collapsing any sort of environment, and I'm going to talk about at a city scale, but this can also apply in building scale. And so on the left here, you have an example of a very simple layout with 3 buildings and various paths between them. And that is what you would use to compute what they would call an axial map. And the axial map is what is used to make the predictions that I will use for the rest of my talk. In terms of what an axial map is made up, it's quite simple, where you have each of the intersections are made up of white dots on this plan, and they're known as nodes and graphs. And the paths between each intersections are denoted by lines. And so from that, you have a rough depiction of pretty much the overall layout of an environment. And you can take that one step further and quantify it so that you can actually make predictions about behavior. And you do that by, in this case, I've shown the connectivity between the environments, and that is quite a simple measure where you pick a path and you simply count the number of intersections that it intersects with. And there are other measures too, but that's the most important one that I'm going to talk about in this talk. As for how something like connectivity seems to influence our behavior, what you typically, at the bottom here, I have a map of just a standard city layout. And this is actually Waterloo, the city where I come from. And it's a map of the connectivity of the various roads in the environment, where red is most highly connected, and that's actually the main street of the town, and blue is the least connected. And typically what you find when you look at how connectivity relates to behavior is if you look at a discrete area in the space, so if we look at this area space, which we'll call highly intelligible because it's constructed in a very systematic way where the roads are all very connected with each other, but other factors are important too, that you will often see that when a route is more connected, if you look at the number of people, if you count the number of people going through at an intersection at a given point in time, if the route's very connected, you'll see more people. If it's less connected, you'll see fewer. And that's precisely what I've depicted here in the scatter plot, where we have the number of observations at a given point for every path in the area of the environment, and we have plotted the connectivity for each of the locations. And there's actually a fairly strong relationship between the two, but only when the environment is constructed systematically. If we pick an area where it isn't so much systematic, where it's designed to be possibly a suburb where you actually want people to feel like they're segregated away from the city core, we actually see that the people are distributing their movement more across all the passing environment, and there actually isn't this preference for connectivity. And so from this, because we see this across internationally across various cities, across a lot of different environments and buildings too, it's been argued that we do use these factors automatically when we navigate, that they don't demand attention at all, and that they don't demand experience. And it's this first point that I have a bit of an issue with, and this is what I'm going to speak to today. Also, I'd like to add just that there's been relatively little studies of behavior at the individual level. Because you're relying on traffic counts, you're making a lot of assumptions about how individuals might behave. And so the studies that I'm going to discuss, we actually put people in VR and we had them navigate through the environment, and we can see the exact routes that they're using throughout the thing, as opposed to just assuming that they're preferring specific ones. To address the first point, the point that I have the issue with, that attention isn't important, I felt it was this is where the neuroscience comes in, where we take advantage of the fact that we can measure the responses of the autonomic nervous system, such that when someone is more attentive, we can see that in various behaviors. And the first one I'm introducing here is people's blink rate. Typically what you find is when someone is more attentive, they are going to blink less. So an example of that is we go to a movie, oftentimes you'll find that people's blink rate is synchronized with lulls in the action sequences. And this isn't something that we consciously do, it's just something that is outside of our control. And not only that, but you can also see when people mind wander, they are more likely to also, their blink rate is also increasing. So there is a bit of a relationship between what you're attending to and your blink rate. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this measure for this topic, because I think it can speak directly to this point that attention is or isn't important in using these sorts of factors. And you can use just very simple eye tracking technology to do blink rate measures. So as part of because we didn't want to rely on one measure, we also brought in two other measures, heart rate frequency and galvanic skin response. Broadly speaking, your heart rate differs a little bit across time when you're more attentive, and your galvanic skin response is a measure of your moisture level on your skin, and it is generally found to increase when you're anxious, such as right now, or when you're, but it also shows responses when you're more attentive. And it can be measured both as a rough change in amplitude. This is an example of what it looks like when you measure it across time, and you can have a change in amplitude over time, so a slow increase, or you can have a number of quick changes over time, which is what I'm calling just our frequency here, and that would be just the number of peaks and changing in the waveform. And we can measure all three of these things in VR while someone navigates. So what I did was immersed people in two virtual environments that they'd never experienced before. Both of them were proposed by Bill Hillier as his initial proposal of space syntax, and they're actually quite handy as a research tool because they're identical environments as far as the buildings that make them up. They both consist of approximately 38 buildings, but you can rearrange them so that the spatial layout is both highly intelligible, in which case it's going to be presumably easier to navigate, or you break up sightlines and you shift them around and the building is a lot less intelligible to navigate. And so we immersed people in these two environments, and we used an HMD VR setup where you just wear a headset and you move using a mouse because it's larger than the room we're testing in. And we have the person navigate to a monument somewhere in the environment, which I have depicted on the right-hand side here. And they have no idea where it is, but they're told that it's in a location where they'd probably find it in a standard city. And once they've found it, they need to find their way back to where they started. And because it's relevant, they started here, and the monument was found in the same location. And these are just two prototypical examples of what a participant saw from actually the exact same location, which is here. So this is the unintelligible environment, the less intelligible environment, this one, and this is the more intelligible environment. You can clearly see that sight lines are longer and that you can actually see that it's more connected. What we found is that as you'd expect, because from the broad work of architecture, that we did see when we observed at the individual level in VR that the most preferred paths in the highly intelligible environment are still seen at the individual level when you have someone navigate to an unfamiliar landmark. People preferred the two most connected paths in the environment, and this is interesting because they're completely unfamiliar with these environments. But when the environment is less intelligible, when it's broken up, so that the sight lines are broken up and the routes are less connected and less integrated, these sorts of things, they're distributing their movement a lot more across the entire environment. And this is good for us because it tells us that we are again seeing what architects have shown before. So now the question is attention important? And I've shown here heat maps of blink rate as it relates to movement through the environment, where the red plumes represent increases from average blink rate, and blue represents no change. And what should be quite evident here is when the environment is highly intelligible, especially on the most connected route, that the blink rate is extremely elevated. And this isn't what we would expect if the process was automatic. We would expect that it would all be pretty much blue, or possibly that you'd see it increase when you deviate from the most connected paths. Also of interest is that in the low intelligible environment, blink rates are pretty much a wash. They are increasing in specific places, but there's no systematicity to it. And that is what I'm showing here as scatter plots too, just to support the idea. In terms of how our other measures relate, this is a bit of a complicated figure, but I want you to take away from this that this is a representation of the correlations between all the different measures that we used. And we have the connectivity and integration, which are both measures of how the spatial system is arranged. And then we have our heart rate, frequency, blink rate, galvanic skin response, and galvanic skin response frequency. And here we have the degree of correlation represented between each of the factors, where black represents a positive correlation and red represents a negative correlation. And the line thickness represents the strength of the relationship between the factors. And what should be quite evident is that there's actually a fairly decent and consistent relationship between the spatial variables of integration and connectivity and all of our measures of attention, such that when connectivity and integration are increased, we also see that blink rate, heart rate, all of our measures also increase. And so this further supports the idea that was shown on the previous slide that attention is important. Interestingly, though, again, when the environment is unstructured, when it's less intelligible, this relationship pretty much goes away, and we largely can't conclusively speak to whether attention is or is not important at this level. From this, I can understand that he wouldn't fully be convinced. So we followed on with a second line of evidence. And we know that tasks that demand attention are especially difficult to perform if you are withdrawing your attention for some reason, if you get distracted, if you're mind wandering, these sorts of things. And as an example of this, I just have a picture of one such case where a pilot mind wandered a little bit, had an inattention slip, and happened to pull up the landing gear while he was still on the ground. And so the question is whether, if someone is prone to attentional slips, whether they're going to change their use of these measures of connective integration, whether they're going to navigate differently than what architects would predict. And we can do this fairly easily by giving participants questionnaires that measure their degree of inattentiveness across their day-to-day experience. And these consist of very simple questions like, I find it difficult to stay focused in the present. I tend to walk quickly where I'm going without thinking, without paying attention along the way. And they just rate that on a 1 to 7 scale. And we can compare people that score high on these scales to people who score low. So people who are extremely prone to attentional slips and people who are extremely prone not to have attentional slips. And we can put them in the exact same task that we did. In this case, we didn't measure their physiological responses, but we had them navigate to a monument. They didn't know where it was, exact same environments though. And then once they found that, navigate their way back out. And these findings, I think, are where it gets especially interesting for architecture as far as space syntax goes. Because for the high scores, we're seeing this is the overall movement, And these are the movements broken up for when they're exploring in from the outside, and then also when they're finding their way back out. And what we see here is for the high scores, the people who are not prone to attentional slips, they're actually following what architects would predict quite handily, and where they're using the most connected routes. In contrast, and they're using it for both when they're exploring in and when they're wayfinding. In contrast, though, when the low scores are behaving quite differently. When they're exploring into the environment, they still use the most connected routes, but it's not nearly as predictable. And even more interestingly, when they're trying to find their way out from the environment, this is where they deviate significantly from the predictions that architects might make. And this is quite clear when you collapse the two movements across, that if you were just relying on aggregate movement, you would not predict this. And so the question, and this is in the systematic environment. The question is, again, what happens when the environment is not systematically arranged? And any good architect probably wouldn't want to design a space like that, but let's ask the question anyways. And so this is also interesting because, again, we see evidence that here attention doesn't seem to be nearly as important. Both the high scores and the low scores seem to be behaving very similarly, where they are exploring a lot more of the environment, and you can it's a lot harder to make predictions as to what they're going to use. There is a bit of a advantage for high scores when they're exploring into the environment, but when they go to find their way back out, they're again exploring a lot more of the environment, and they're having a lot more trouble finding their way back to where they started. And this is very similar to the low scores, who are largely having great difficulty performing the task. And so what these two bodies of evidence seem to suggest is that attention is very important to this process. And so making the assumption that attention isn't important seems to be a significant mistake. And it is advantageous to make that conclusion because, for architecture at least, because it's easier to look at behavior as across a body of individuals without knowing anything about them and make predictions. And in the ideal world, that would be what we would like to do. But I think this evidence clearly speaks to the fact that you might need to know a little bit about your navigators, or might be able to improve your predictions by knowing at least some general factors that might influence them. And we've shown this by looking at both the physiological responses as they vary, and they vary systematically by location, and also that inattentive navigators do not appear to use structural cues. So both of these together support the idea that attention is important. And that in itself is a pretty novel finding, I think. But furthermore, that this is only seen when the environment is coherently structured. And so as researchers, I think it draws attention to the fact that we need to understand what is going on when the environment is less structured. But in terms of architecture and predictions, it also puts further emphasis on the importance of designing a building that is going to be readily navigable for all audiences. Furthermore, and I think the most important part of these findings for the architecture side of things is that it has implications not only for predictive models, but also for the design of space. From this, I think it's fairly clear that attention is important, and we know that certain populations do have difficulty maintaining their attention. It could be as simple as in a school, children we know get distracted quite easily. So if you're designing a school, it might be useful to know that, to pay attention to the fact that if you're trying to predict their behavior based on the layout of an environment, that they might deviate quite differently from the teachers that are teaching at that school. Also, in healthcare settings, we know that patients also have attentional difficulties. Patients with frontal damage typically are less able to maintain their attention and these sorts of things. And so if you're designing a healthcare setting, it's also worth noting that these sorts of models might break down in these sorts of situations. And so from all these findings, I think this does a decent job of drawing attention to the fact that both architecture and both in terms of how research can inform architecture, and also in terms of how architecture can inform research questions. And hopefully this has been a useful talk for you. Thank you.
We have time for just one question.
Hi, M.A. Greenstein from Los Angeles, George Greenstein Institute. Fascinating, important, robust, thank you. The gender question, which shows up a lot in particularly landmark research for hippocampal use as a strategy versus a response. Wondering if you have any data on the gender as well as the age groups.
Age group-wise, I was using just an undergrad population here, so I can't directly speak to that. In terms of gender, there aren't really any certifiable differences that came out of this data set. They both behave largely similarly. It's worth noting that, generally speaking, you see differences when landmarks, again, as you noted, come out. And I did do one version of the environment. You might have noticed from the pictures of the environment that all the buildings look largely the same. I did try a version of the experiment where we did each building, it was a lot more like a city, where each building was distinct. They looked like shops and that sort of thing. And again, we didn't see a difference. So I don't think gender is important in terms of these sorts of predictions. And that's actually somewhat of a good thing for these predictive models, because it means you can assume less about your audience. But it was interesting because you would expect possibly a difference based on the body of research about it.